I love the Borderlands series. I have a lot of fond memories with these games, and in preparation for Borderlands 3 coming out, I've been going back and replaying the previous games in the series. Going back to these games has been nice, comforting even, in a year that has been pretty challenging just on a whole host of levels. But while replaying these games, I began to re-encounter a problem I'd had with them. I had to put a lot of effort into not caring about the loot. Now that I've come back to Borderlands, all these years down the line, and my perspective on games has evolved and changed a lot, I've finally found the words for something I've always felt, but never really been able to express. Loot is the weakest part of these games. Not just the least good part, it is actually detrimental to the play of these games and the design of them too. I'm going to be coming at this mostly from the angle of Borderlands, but this is just an example. The flaws of loot-based gameplay run deep. Part 1. What am I looting for? The first thing I'm going to do is to try and set out my stall a bit, and to try and establish what it is that I'm going to be talking about. See, lots of games feature what we might call loot or looting with a lowercase l, but that doesn't necessarily make them loot-based. So I'm going to try and set out some loose parameters. These won't be a definitive definition, mind you. Different games may or may not have these features in varying amounts. The three key traits that I want to hone in on, and I'll be discussing each of them in more detail, are randomness / procedural generation, an aggressive damage curve, and finally, a heavy emphasis on presentation. Again, this won't ever be definitive or all-encompassing, but I do think that the overlap of these traits does narrow in on the core of what would be considered loot-based gameplay by most people. Part 2. Roll up, roll up. So the first of the key traits of loot I want to discuss is the role of randomness and or procedural generation. Now obviously, loot-based gameplay is not the only instance of randomness in games, but it has got a particular implementation that I want to discuss. As the name would imply, loot-based gameplay puts a heavy emphasis on looting, and randomness plays an integral role in the creation and distribution of that loot. Sticking with Borderlands as an example, every item in the game is procedurally generated from a library of potential components. Every time an enemy needs a weapon or a chest needs to be filled, then the game rolls some new items and drops them in. Depending on the size of that library, this can create a broad number of potential combinations. At the moment, Borderlands 3 is advertising itself as having over 1 billion guns, which is a heck of a step up from the 87 bazillion guns advertised for Borderlands 2. Heck, it's actually a real number this time. Can't wait for someone to data mine the game and run the numbers to see if it actually is possible. So the idea of that many potential combinations, real number or not, is very attention-grabbing, very inspiring to the imagination. But there is a caveat. Borderlands can generate lots of variations on guns with different appearances, different features and abilities, and countless variations on stats, but most of them are pretty meaningless. While it will almost never be possible to find two guns with the exact same stats, most players will sooner or later start to notice some patterns. Most gear is going to inevitably fall into an archetype or a role. From my own experience, when it comes to switching up my gear, then the deciding factor is almost always going to be the damage. It doesn't matter if I like one gun's particular sight, or recoil, or reload speed. If it can't do enough damage to my enemies, it is useless. More on that later. Once you start to notice the archetypes, you're going to look for a gun that fills the same role as the one you want to replace, even if it isn't exactly the same. The vast majority of differences between weapons are minor tweaks to stats that aren't particularly meaningful, or are mostly just cosmetic. While procedural loot generation can create hundreds, thousands, or even millions of different items, most of them will be solidly in the middling area and be relatively indistinct from one another. Not to mention that most loot-based games don't even feature this added layer of procedural generation, and most loot will just be the exact same items over and over again. Like I said, most people are going to notice these patterns sooner or later, but this is only scratching the surface of how randomness affects these games. The real meat of the question is to be found in how items are distributed, and more importantly, how the player is rewarded with them. To get an item in a loot-based game, you have to do one of two things. Either get a drop from an enemy, or find it in a chest of some kind. Now, loot-based games do occasionally have merchants of some kind, but typically the goods they sell are going to be worthless compared to what you'll be finding, or they may have one or two good items, but will primarily exist to buy your junk off of you. Now, some of you may have already spotted the problem with this whole setup, though. See, a player doesn't actually have any control over what items an enemy drops, or if they even drop one at all. And they also have no control over what is found inside a chest. What decides all of these things is randomness, something entirely beyond the player's control. Random rewards don't actually reward the player. When a player gets a rare item, it wasn't dedication or talent or anything the player did that gave them that drop. It was just a roll of the dice. When a player finds a rare item in a chest, they didn't really find it. The contents of chests are randomized. Sure, there comes a rush with seeing that rare item glow, but it wasn't really something the player did. Players are set up to feel a sense of fulfillment, a sense of pride and accomplishment, if you will, as a result of something beyond our control. We're conditioned to conflate our sense of skill and ability at a game with the random rewards it rolls out. While replaying Borderlands 2, I actually got annoyed with the hidden chests scattered around the world because they weren't actually going to contain something secret as a reward for exploration. They were just another roll of the dice, the same as any other chest. And then it hit me. The roll of the dice is the reward. The loot inside is just the result of that roll. Randomness can create a very broad spread of possible rewards, and that means that the theoretical fun potential can be quite high, but little to no players will actually experience it, and only looking at the potential peaks is a little dishonest, a little bit of sleight of hand. When games try to appeal with loot, they're setting up this fallacy where they make you dream of all the diamonds you could find while ignoring all the rough you have to dig through. Part 3. Tell me about the numbers, Mason. The next component I want to discuss is the type of damage curves found in loot-based games. All games with some form of combat theoretically have a damage curve of some kind. They're basically just how the growth in a player's strength over the course of a game would chart out. Some damage curves are relatively flat, while others steadily grow over the course of a game as players acquire new abilities and equipment. But not all damage curves serve the same purpose, as they can be used to reinforce different aspects of a game's design. Some damage curves serve to push players to engage with the mechanics of combat, to know their available moves and how to combine them to take down tougher enemies. These are the damage curves you find in games such as Devil May Cry, where there is no real progression that straight up just makes you do more damage. Instead, you learn different combos that all have different timings and ranges to make none objectively better than any other. Each has its pros and cons. However, lots of games use damage curves for less compelling reasons. In some games, a player's growth comes not from the available mechanics and the player's understanding of them expanding, but from boring upgrades. You know the kind, where you take your sword to a blacksmith and pay some money and resources, and now your sword is a +1 sword that functions exactly the same as it did before, but now it does enough damage to keep up with the enemies in the new area you've unlocked. In these kinds of games, the enemies grow more powerful as you progress, so you need to upgrade your gear to keep up with them. Not really to make it better than it was, but to keep up with the growing strength of your foes. Upgrades that do nothing but embiggen the numbers on your equipment are bad, even when Dark Souls does it. The damage curve here pushes you to need to upgrade your weapon on a regular basis. It drives you to engage with the embiggening mechanic, to be thinking about materials and costs and when to return to the blacksmith, to give you a bunch of short-term goals on a regular basis. But I honestly think that these short-term goals could do with being replaced, because they don't drive players to engage more with the mechanics of gameplay anyway, especially when the resources you need to upgrade your equipment come from random drops. There is nothing the player can really do here anyway. I think that a lot of games would do just fine if they took out these upgrades that only embiggen the numbers and stuck to upgrades that actually alter a weapon's properties more meaningfully, like Dark Souls does with the infusions. Loot-based games are what you get when, rather than looking at a boring upgrade system and thinking, we should replace this entirely, you look at it and think, we just need to spice this up a little. These games don't use boring linear upgrade systems, though. You can't enhance the gear you already have. You instead have to throw it out and acquire new gear. And that aggressive damage curve is there to make sure that you need to completely cycle your inventory every couple of levels. Loot is the new embiggening mechanic. Again, the goal of becoming more powerful in these games isn't really to become more powerful, it's to keep up with the enemies who are growing in strength all the time too. The proportional relationship between a gun and an enemy of the same level will always be the same. While at first the thought of a gun doing 4,000 damage a shot sounds exciting, when you only deal 4 damage a shot, it doesn't actually mean that much if by the time you get it, enemies have 20,000 hit points instead of 20. When Borderlands 3 was being revealed, it was announced that a new co-op mode would be introduced, one that let players of vastly different levels play together without worry. A level 3 character would fight enemies as though they were level 3, while a level 50 character would fight the same enemies as though they were level 50. This sounds pretty neat and opens up co-op a lot more to friends who may not have equal amounts of free time, but as soon as I heard about it, I was honestly a little taken aback, because it seems to pretty much confirm the idea that weapon damage is always just relevant to the damage curve, and that the goal of the curve is just to make your weapons obsolete on a regular basis, so that looting more gear is unavoidable. The damage curves of loot-based games don't drive engagement with the mechanics of the actual gameplay. Again, they just drive engagement with the embiggening mechanic, which instead of just a boring linear upgrade system, is now the random rewards of loot. Part 4. What could it be? The last, but definitely not the least, of these key components is the presentation. The way that loot-based games present their loot is a big part of what draws the line between lowercase looting and uppercase looting. When an enemy drops an item in a loot-based game, it doesn't just fall to the floor, another prop on the stage for the player to pick up if they feel like it. In these games, or at least when the roll lands in the player's favor, that is, an enemy dropping an item will typically come with a small flash of light to get your attention, bonus points for additional sound effects, and the item will then begin to glow and emit a beam of light that rises skywards, announcing its rarity from a distance. And chests? Chests take it to a whole other level. Chests that just pop their lids off a little and show you a list of their contents, like in a game such as Skyrim, are not welcome here. When you open a chest in a loot-based game, it takes its time, as locks will start to click open, gears will turn and whine, platforms will rise and unfold from the depths as the beams of loot light slowly emerge to reveal the rarity of the items you have found. The rarer the chest, the more complex that opening is going to be, the greater the sense of wonder they try to instill in the player. All of this serves a goal to create a very specific reaction from a player. Anticipation. Anticipation is one of the defining traits of loot-based games. When you open that chest in Skyrim, and it just pops up that menu and tells you everything in it, the player doesn't have the time or the need to wonder about what it might be inside, but loot-based games are all about making you wait just those few seconds to make your mind start to wonder, to make you feel anticipation. Now, it's worth pointing out that there's nothing inherently wrong with creating a sense of anticipation in a game, or even anticipation when opening a chest in a game, but it's the particular implementation that matters here, just like how there is a place for randomness in games, and how damage curves aren't automatically bad either. The anticipation when opening a chest should just be the icing on the cake. Getting to the chest should be rewarding in its own right. The item inside should be rewarding in its own right. But loot-based games effectively want to make a cake entirely out of icing. A part of the reason why these games need to drive you to keep looting all the time is because the hit you get from opening a chest, that wonder and excitement and anticipation, is short-lived, and you'll need another hit soon. What's actually inside the chest doesn't really matter as much as the moment just before it opens, when we dream up all the things it could be. Loot makes us excited about something before we even know what it is. To feel that anticipation just from seeing a beam of light of a rare color. And a lot of the time, when the chest does open, when we do finally get to examine the item and see what it does or what it even is, it's not for our character, or it doesn't work with our skills, or, well, it's just not really something we're looking for. And the thing is, we just move on. Because there's always next time. We'll remember the highs, the times we find something super rare or cool, but we will almost instantly move on from the lows, the times we don't find anything. These moments of anticipation are key in making us feel like we're getting some kind of reward for something when we're not. Like I said before, good players don't get good drops and bad players don't get bad drops. Everyone gets random drops, and we're just conditioned to feel responsible when we win, and like we just need to try more when we lose. Because loot promises a reward that could be anything, it doesn't have to be anything. The best drop is the item we dream of in that split second before we know what we've actually gotten, because it could be it. Part 5. What does it mean? With establishing what I think are the core components and flaws of loot out of the way, I think it's time to look at how this impacts the design of these games. As I said before, I'll be honing in on the Borderlands games in particular as an example. See, very few of Borderlands' actual gameplay mechanics have an effect on the loot you receive. In fact, the only thing that can affect the odds of getting loot is a relic that was, you guessed it, a pre-order bonus. And the actual gameplay is pretty disconnected from the looting. Loot just really being the method of distributing weapons and gear, and the key embiggening mechanic. What makes up the actual meaningful play of Borderlands is the gunplay, using a variety of weapons, both conventional and zany, to take on enemies with different weaknesses and abilities, and to combine your gunplay with each character's unique action skill and skill tree abilities to create a playstyle. And if you asked me, this is where the real appeal of Borderlands is. Well, from a gameplay perspective anyway. The writing and characters are plenty appealing too. This is where a player is most engaged with the mechanics and gameplay. This is where the real fun is. And there's actually more to add on to this too. Certain items have unique effects or properties that can interact with your build and skills to further complement your playstyle. But this is where the problems start. See, Borderlands uses a rarity system, so the game is already built in a way that tells us what the best items in the game are. These being legendary items and unique items. Now, side note here, there are some items that exist above legendary in Borderlands, but for the purpose of this discussion, they effectively exist in the same category, so I'm just going to lump them in here. These legendary and unique items each have unique properties, such as the shield that gets thrown like a grenade when it empties, or the grenade that explodes every time it bounces, that set them apart from the rest of the loot pool. And in fact, many of them feel like they're the original, that all the rest of the items are built in lesser imitations of. The majority of the 87 bazillion guns do not play off your build the same way these items can. But what's extra telling is these unique and legendary items that constitute the meaningful high-level play and make up the endgame use almost entirely fixed parts or extremely limited variations. The best items in the game exist in spite of the procedural loot generation system, not because of it. And thanks to our old friend the damage curve, these items will still become obsolete, and they can take your playstyle with them when they go. Part 6. Where did it come from? Where did it go? So, I've been talking about loot in a particular way up until now, saying things like, loot tricks us into feeling a certain way, rather than saying the developers are tricking us into feeling a certain way. And the reason for that is pretty simple. I think that a lot of these fallacies are pitfalls that affect the developers just as much as they affect the players. It's easy to focus only on the good times, to think about how awesome a player will feel when they get a cool item, and to just sort of gloss over the rest of the possibilities that aren't exciting. A part of what makes this so easy is that loot has been around long enough that it's a context unto itself. It doesn't exist as the intersection of other systems and design decisions. Just asking, is this game loot-based, is a valid question by itself. Nowadays, loot-based gameplay is most associated with online games, MMOs like World of Warcraft, or other online games like Destiny or The Division all use it in some form or another, and the appeal for developers here is pretty clear. Online games need a consistent player base in order to survive, and to keep players playing between major updates, they're going to need hooks to keep players logging back in, and also a way to give players stuff to do indefinitely while hiding the need for repetition. Loot-based gameplay is a natural fit. But while the Borderlands series does feature online elements, it's pretty much just co-op. It doesn't need to survive the same way other games do. And Borderlands is touted as the original looter shooter. Destiny and The Division were following in its footsteps. So why then did it use loot at all? Why does loot even exist? I think the answer is actually fairly simple and a little underwhelming. People just enjoyed it, in much the same way they do now. People got the same rushes out of these random mechanics years ago, just like we can get rushes out of them today. The problem is that these rushes have probably always been dodgy. They weren't done maliciously, they were done out of a genuine desire to give people a good time. See, the real use of randomness in games is as a surrogate system, to make up for something that a game either doesn't or, more often, can't simulate. Early games couldn't simulate combat the same way modern games can, so they decided whether an attack hit or miss with a roll of the dice. And while RNG-based combat phased out, as more player-controlled combat rolled in, some other RNG-based elements still survived, item drops being the obvious survivor. While some games do go the route of every item must be an actual in-game item that the player can use, another option was to have only some items be usable by the player, and randomness was a natural fit to decide what pieces the player received. Simulating every item on an enemy potentially breaking during a fight would be pretty extreme after all. Well, at least this is kind of what I always assumed was the explanation behind random drop rates anyway, that not all of an enemy's gear would be salvageable after, killing them. But at this stage, I think a lot of games just use random drop rates because they've been around so long, they're just sort of grandfathered into game design. The same flaws still existed before online gaming though, like I've said, and these systems were always quite arbitrary. An item's rarity had to be decided by a developer, and whether or not it dropped by an invisible roll of the dice. There was nothing players could do. You know the old saying, do not attribute to malice what can be explained by ignorance? I actually think that's pretty relevant here. Loot-based gameplay hinges on getting players hooked on that feeling of anticipation, that rush when they find something cool that is entirely determined by random chance. Again, I don't think the designers behind these mechanics did so with anything resembling malice in their hearts, and I don't think they, or most people making up their audiences, would have much of a reason to be even half as critical of these mechanics then as I am now. They were just there to try and make a game more fun, to give some variation, and to make people happy. But, well, I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room. Part 7. Loot boxes. It's undeniable that loot boxes are an extension of loot-based gameplay. Whether you see them as a perversion of loot or as the inevitable progression of it, the connection is unavoidable. It isn't a coincidence that Overwatch's loot boxes use the same color rarity system as World of Warcraft. It was the advent of loot boxes and the knock-on effect they've had on design that pushed the envelope far enough that I had to take a step back and start to notice the cracks that had been there all along. They're built on blind, random purchases. They take every trick used to create anticipation in loot-based gameplay and turn it up to 11. And while cosmetic loot boxes, like those in Overwatch, don't have a damage curve to drive a constant need for more looting, timed event loot boxes, seasonal rewards, and the constantly growing pile of junk items versus the small amount of good items fills that role, puts that pressure there to keep looting on a regular basis. After spending more money on loot boxes than I'd like to admit, I had to just cut myself off and realize that I was getting hooked, that these loot boxes were chock full of tricks to make opening a box feel amazing when it really wasn't. The bad taste loot boxes left me with once I had broken free was enough to make me not only re-examine my critical stance on loot boxes and microtransactions, but on loot as a whole. These tricks weren't designed as insidious manipulations, but they were easily co-opted into them. The threads tying the rewards of loot to actual gameplay were so tenuous that it was possible to separate them entirely and to sell loot at a premium. Part 8. Boy howdy, that got heavy. So this has gotten a little heavy, so I'd like to take a small break and to come at this from a bit of a more light-hearted angle. I want to tell you the story of the moment that broke me. While browsing the Borderlands wiki, I learned of a cool sounding gun named the Twister. It was an elemental Jacobs shotgun, which already made it rarer than a unicorn, but its most unique and fascinating aspect was that its pellets spun in the air like a tornado when fired. This is already a cool idea, but when you pair this with Zero's ability Bore, which makes your shots pierce enemies and do 100% extra damage every time they do, it becomes really cool. The pellets spin. They can hit the same enemy multiple times if you pull your shots right. Hot damn, if that ain't a meaningful playstyle, then I don't know what is. The rub is how you have to get the gun. It drops from a mini-boss enemy in the Sir Hammerlock's Big Game Hunt DLC. So far, this is pretty par for the course, but it's about to get a heck of a lot worse in more ways than one. I'm going to just try and push the can of worms that is Sir Hammerlock's Big Game Hunt to the side and focus on the relevant design elements, but be warned, it's probably going to sneak back in. The Twister has a 33% chance to drop from a particular enemy. This is actually a pretty high drop rate for a unique item, but don't worry, the downhill slide is going to start now. The enemy that drops the twister is named Omd Ok, and you may be wondering where that enemy is because you don't ever remember encountering him. That's because he doesn't appear in the world naturally. A different enemy can turn into him. Who, you ask? Well, when a witch doctor buffs an enemy, they transform into a more powerful form, and Omd Ok is what you get when an ultimate badass savage transforms. Ultimate badass savages also do not normally spawn, as they are the upgraded form of the super badass savage, which in turn only appears when a regular badass savage is upgraded by a witch doctor. I should mention that a badass savage is not what you get when a witch doctor buffs a regular savage. Those become bloodthirsty savages or something similar. A badass savage is a separate enemy. So okay, you need to find a badass savage and a witch doctor and have the witch doctor buff the badass savage 3 times. This is unlikely to happen in the course of ordinary play. For one, the witch doctors only buff their allies occasionally, and they will take time out of their busy schedule to attack you too. And also, every single piece of game knowledge you have will likely tell you to kill the caster first. Aside from this being an almost universal instinct in games, the base game has already been teaching you this with the surveyor enemies, drones that heal or shield their allies. Okay, so this isn't likely to happen unintentionally, but once you know about it, you can just let it happen, right? Well, it's not actually that simple, because it turns out that once a super badass savage becomes an ultimate badass savage, there is only a 1% chance that the buff spell from the witch doctor will upgrade them. So to sum up, that's a 33% chance to drop from an enemy, with a 1% chance to spawn, if you artificially create a circumstance that would almost never occur in regular gameplay. So it's worth pointing out that the development of Sir Hammerlock's big game hunt was to some extent outsourced. Something that Gearbox has a somewhat spotty history with. And this is clearly a particularly extreme example of bad design, and personally I think that the design discussion behind Omd Ok started and ended with the idea of him being a secret enemy, but I think it's worth looking at because what makes it so bad is that it's the flaws inherent to random design magnified. Very few other instances will be this obscenely bad, but the same flaws are still there, just smaller. Less visible, but never truly gone. Part 9. You got a better idea? Lots of people enjoy loot-based games, and for a lot of reasons, so I want to take a look at what the good stuff is and how it can maybe be done better. First up is that sense of progression that you get from getting gear with ever higher numbers. Yes, it's undeniable that when you face up against lower level enemies in any game with a leveling system, you'll feel like you've come on leaps and bounds, but part of the problem here is that it is entirely artificial. What makes you better than those weaker enemies isn't that you're a better player, it's just your numbers have been embiggened. Not to mention that fighting low-level enemies at a higher level can quickly become boring, and you'd have to backtrack to encounter them anyway. Compare this to, say, Dark Souls. Okay, look, I know that comparing games to Dark Souls is a thing, but please just let me have this one. Compare this to Dark Souls, where player knowledge and ability are key parts of progression. When starting a new playthrough of Dark Souls, even though my character and gear are as weak as they can be, I still feel like I have grown compared to my first playthrough. I am more powerful, even if my character is exactly the same. Now, Dark Souls' hands aren't entirely clean in all of this, like I mentioned before, but that player progression really is worth bringing up. Second up is the appeal of unintended play, of getting something game-breaking. The procedural generation systems and random drop rates spitting out some item that feels beyond what the developers expected. Unfortunately, what often makes a rare item more powerful is that it's just ahead on the curve, effectively equivalent to a common weapon a couple of levels higher. And so as the enemies catch up, it will inevitably become little more than a shinier gun, and will become obsolete in a few levels more, just like any other. It's also worth remembering that developers can, have, and will patch items that they think actually are game-breaking. In the case of Borderlands, the effects of amp shields on shotguns were heavily nerfed. To top it off, we've got the same fallacies from before, where we assign our sense of self-worth as a player to the results of random elements beyond our control, and where we're ignoring the overwhelming possibility of getting bad or mostly mediocre results in exchange for focusing only on the best possible results. A trap that I think affects both players and designers alike. While recording footage of Dark Souls to use in this video, I actually got a rare Black Knight weapon from the first Black Knight in the game. Black Knight weapons are considered incredibly powerful if you get them in the early game, and these Black Knights don't respawn. You can still get their weapons later on, but it seems really odd that some players will get a weapon that is considered game-breaking early on for no reason other than randomness. And on top of that, they might not even be using a build that could benefit from that weapon anyway. Random drop rates and item distribution are bad. Even when Dark Souls... especially when Dark Souls does it. So much of the appeal of these games comes from the sense of player control and skill mattering, that item drops being up to RNG is just incredibly out of place. And okay, all of this aside, it's also worth comparing all of this to Breath of the Wild, where players were able to come up with incredible tricks such as tree launching, and even come up with puzzle solutions that the developers never intended to be possible because the systems behind Link's abilities were solidly crafted, and because the players were able to use their knowledge of those abilities to create their own way of playing. Random design does not have anything resembling a monopoly on unintended gameplay. Next up is that there is some potential appeal to farming in games. Some players either like it or at least don't mind it, and I can certainly see the appeal. Sometimes you don't want to give a game your full attention, and being able to slip into a pattern of repetition where you can play almost entirely on autopilot is nice. Maybe you're tired, maybe you want to do something while listening to a podcast or a video or something. Whatever the reason, it's nice to play the game without worrying about progressing, without it taking too much concentration, and you'll eventually get a little reward out of it to boot. The problem is that farming is the only way to guarantee getting an item, and that's because the only way to get something is to keep rolling the dice until you get the drop. Again, this does not actually reward the player. It doesn't reward them for their skill or their time commitment. Unless, of course, we do take it that the roll of the dice is the intended reward, which would certainly be more cohesive, but would be its own can of worms as well. Games are better off rewarding players for their actual actions. While having the option to do something in-game that is low concentration is nice, we may be better off just playing entirely separate games for those experiences. Insert Stardew Valley joke here. There are better ways to reward players with items like Monster Hunter's tail cutting and part breaking, or how the Surge shrunk this mechanic down for human enemies with its limb targeting mechanics. There are better ways to do rewards, and having experienced them, it's hard to go back to games with random drop rates like Dark Souls, and going back to loot is way harder. And finally, I want to look at the social appeals of loot. Players can compare their stories and items with one another, but this has the same problem with assigning our own worth to random items again. If your friend tells you about a cool item they got, you may get jealous or maybe just feel a little disheartened because you've never gotten anything like that, which just puts extra pressure on you to loot more. But okay, bragging mechanics aside, there are still plenty more social appeals. After all, since loot is almost always found in games with online components, that usually means that there are ways to play alongside your friends, to go on missions and fight bosses. Farming a raid in a game like Destiny can be a pretty fun experience and a pretty powerful bond forger. In a situation like that, it is you and your friends versus the game. Not just your digital avatars fighting the digital enemies the game spits out at you, it is you and your actual friends united versus the actual game. If that isn't an opportunity for a bond to be forged, then I don't know what is. The problem with this, though, is that what makes it fun is the friends you're doing it with. The loot-based gameplay isn't what made it fun. The people you did it with is. It's really more of a side effect, if anything. I mean, anything can be more fun if you do it with the right people. I've had genuinely great times playing Monopoly with some of my family and friends, and I know that not everyone can meet up in person to hang out and play casual board games all the time, but that's where stuff like Tabletop Simulator or other digital board games come to mind, or even just farming in Minecraft. Farming. I'd rather play a silly card game or board game with my friends than farm a raid just so we'd all be united by our hatred of the RNG. Part 10. Root Folder. All media is smoke and mirrors, to varying extents, but video games especially. While it may prove to be the most controversial take I have offered today, I think I still need to say it. Video games aren't real. Video games consist of weightless digital puppets interacting with more weightless digital puppets. A lot of time and effort has to be put into making a bunch of dancing pixels feel like something they're not, to make those puppets feel like they have weight both physically and metaphorically. Making any art is already amazing and inspiring, but I think video games are especially beautiful from a creative perspective. One of the most powerful aspects of video games is the interactivity. It's the thing that sets them apart from most other art. When you watch a film, it's a passive experience. You aren't involved directly. While films make you feel something, it's all about empathizing with the character, someone separate from yourself. Video games, on the other hand, make you feel something by making you a part of the character you control. While there's still going to be some distance between the player and character, the intimacy games offer far surpasses what films do. When a film character accomplishes a goal, we think, they did it. But when a video game character accomplishes a goal, we think, I did it. And this is a key part of games. One of the most compelling and powerful abilities of the medium, and when used responsibly, it's great. But it can be misused. No other medium can make the audience feel as personally involved as games can. Video games are built on the idea that you can take something entirely synthetic, artificial, from the sound of footsteps to the color of grass, and not only make the audience feel something, but feel like they are a part of it. Not just an outside viewer, to feel personally invested in and responsible for what happens. But like most superpowers, heck, like most art, this power to make people feel things on such a personal level can be used a lot of different ways. Like I've said before, I don't think the designers behind these mechanics or games were intentionally trying to use the intimacy games offer to manipulate their audiences. I really, truly don't. But more and more we see games using the direct connection they forge with their players to abuse them, to manipulate them. The flaw here really is just that video games are vulnerable to being used abusively, something that is true for all art at the end of the day. But video games have that deeper connection, that ability to make you feel things in ways other mediums can't, that makes these abuses so much more harmful when they happen. Premium loot boxes, aggressively monetized games, both free to play and full price, manipulative tactics of all kind did not spring forth fully formed one day. They are evolutions of what came before, and they're built around the core idea of making people feel something they can feel awesome about because they did it, but for a price. If the envelope had never been pushed as far as it has been, if we never saw the likes of Star Wars Battlefront 2 or FIFA Ultimate Team, would I be making these criticisms? Probably not. But the envelope hasn't just been pushed, it's been folded into a paper airplane and thrown. I honestly think it's depressing and disrespectful to see all the hard work and effort that has gone into techniques to make games feel real and to make us feel things when playing them be misused the way they are now. All the things I love about loot-based games aren't tied to the loot, they're buried under it. I don't think I've ever met a person who wholeheartedly loves everything about loot, but they put up with the frustrating parts to get to the parts they do enjoy. But the problem is that the things that are frustrating about loot are inextricable, while the parts that are fun are either shallow and artificially inflated, or can be separated entirely. It wasn't until I'd experienced the better options to loot, like the Surge and Monster Hunter, that I was able to fully voice my frustrations with random drop rates in other games. I honestly don't think I'm going to change anyone's mind here, but instead I'm hoping to help people who already feel the cracks in loot-based gameplay to find the words they need to express themselves. I sure felt them a long time ago, but without the push of loot boxes, wouldn't have been able to articulate the problems. I'm not looking to tell anyone that their fun is wrong either. I just hope I can help people separate the good parts of these games from the bad a little easier. Borderlands 3 is almost out, and I am excited for it. I like the characters, I like the look of the abilities, I love the world and the story and the moment-to-moment gameplay, but I'm not excited by the loot. When I do play Borderlands 3, I will have to put a lot of effort into not caring about that loot, because it's a game where the best, safest, and healthiest strategy is to not play. Also, I spent over 3 hours of my life trying to get the Twister, and then it became worthless a few levels later, which is total bullshit.